The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Evan Kowalski's daughter asked him why their car had rust on the door. He told her rust meant a car had stories. She was 8, and she accepted that the way 8-year-olds accept most things, with a nod and a pivot to something else entirely. By the time they pulled into the school parking lot, she'd moved on to asking whether clouds were made of cotton candy in another dimension. He said probably. She said she thought so too. That was the morning. The letter was the afternoon. It came in a cream-colored envelope, the kind that feels substantial in your hand, the kind that costs money. His name was typed on the front. Not handwritten, typed, centered, like something official. The return address said Vance and Alderton Group, Corporate Affairs Division, Cincinnati, Ohio. Evan didn't open it right away. He set it on the workbench next to a half-rebuilt carburetor and finished what he was doing, which was torquing down the valve cover on a 2009 F-150 that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Beverly, who'd been driving it since the Obama administration and planned to drive it until one of them died. He respected that. He respected most things about Beverly, actually, including the fact that she brought him coffee when she dropped the truck off and didn't hover. When he finally opened the letter, his hands were clean because he'd wiped them on the shop rag first out of habit, even though the letter didn't care. He read it twice. Then he set it down. Then he picked it up and read it a third time. The Vance and Alderton Group was acquiring Harman Automotive. Harman Automotive was the company Evan had spent 11 years building from a regional supplier into one of the most respected mid-tier manufacturers of precision transmission components in the Midwest. He'd left 3 years ago, after Claire died, when he couldn't be in Columbus anymore, couldn't be in any city anymore, if he was honest, and had moved to Delwood, population 6,000, to open a garage and breathe. But his departure hadn't changed the terms of his original co-founder agreement. According to the document now sitting on his workbench, Evan still held a 14% equity stake in Harman Automotive. And Vance and Alderton was about to acquire Harman for $1.2 billion. He did the math in his head. Then he did it again because the first answer seemed wrong. It wasn't wrong. He put the letter in the drawer under the cash register, told himself he'd deal with it tomorrow, and went to pick up his daughter from school. Her name was Nadia. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw and an opinion about everything, which she came by honestly from both sides. She was telling him about a conflict with her best friend over whose turn it was to pick the game at recess when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Then again. He looked at it at a red light. 7 missed calls from a number with a Cincinnati area code he didn't recognize. He let them go to voicemail. That night, after Nadia was in bed, he listened to the messages. They were all from the same woman. Her name was Sylvie Hartman, and she identified herself as Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at Vance and Alderton Group. Her voice was precise and professionally warm, the kind of voice that had been coached. She said she was reaching out because the acquisition required his cooperation, that his equity stake was significant, and that the closing was scheduled for 30 days out. She said it would be in everyone's interest to discuss the matter at his earliest convenience. Evan deleted the messages and went to bed. In the morning, he made Nadia's lunch, turkey and Swiss, the crusts cut off, apple slices, a note that said, "I love you, don't eat the eraser," and drove her to school and came back and opened the drawer and looked at the letter again. 14% of $1.2 billion. He hadn't known the company was being sold. Nobody had called him. Not his former partner, Brett Harman, who'd bought out his day-to-day role when Evan left, but hadn't touched the equity structure. Not the company lawyers. Not anyone. The first he'd heard of it was a form letter that arrived the same day his daughter asked about rust. He thought about Claire. She would have known exactly what to do. She'd been the one with the business mind between them. Sharp, strategic, able to read a room from the doorway. He was the engineer. He understood systems, tolerances, the particular language of things that worked and things that didn't. What he didn't understand, standing in his shop in Delwood with a letter in his hand, was why Vance and Alderton had sent that letter to him instead of calling his lawyer. Unless they didn't know he had one. He called his lawyer. Her name was Patricia. No, wait. He went through his contacts. Diane Cresswell, family law, Columbus. Not the right kind. He kept scrolling, found the name he wanted. Frank Okafor, business and contracts. Cleveland, they'd worked together during the Harmon founding period. Good man. Straight shooter. Frank picked up on the second ring. When Evan explained what he had in front of him, Frank was quiet for a long moment. You're still on the cap table, Frank said. Apparently, Brett never restructured it after you left. Apparently not. Another pause. Evan, 14% of $1.2 billion is, I know what it is. That's $168 million. I know. Before taxes. Frank, I'm just saying it out loud so we're both in the same conversation. Frank's voice shifted into gear. Don't talk to Vance and Alderton without me present. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to their calls. Forward me that letter today, and I'll have someone in our corporate group look at the acquisition agreement. Even said he would. He forwarded the letter from his phone, standing in the shop doorway, watching a crow walk across the hood of Beverly's truck like it owned it. 4 days later, Frank called back. There's a problem, he said. Evan had expected that, in the way you expect weather when the sky looks wrong. What kind? Brett restructured the board 18 months ago. New governance documents, new shareholder resolutions. Somewhere in that process, there's a signature page that purports to be yours, authorizing the removal of your veto rights over major asset sales. Evan stood very still. That's not my signature. I didn't think so. But it's on file. I haven't signed anything for Harmon in 3 years, not since the day I walked out. I believe you. The question is proving it. Frank exhaled. Vance and Alderton is moving forward on the assumption that you have no blocking rights. They've got Brett telling them everything is clean. The closing is in 26 days. What do I do? You come to Columbus, in person, and you bring me every document you ever signed for that company because we're going to need the handwriting comparison, and we're going to need it fast. Evan looked around the shop. 2 cars in the bay, a third coming Thursday. Natia had a school project due Friday. I can't just leave. I know. But Evan, Frank stopped, started again. If you don't show up and contest this, you lose everything. Not just the money, your name, your work, 11 years of what you built. Brett and Vance and Alderton will close this deal, and you will have been erased from it like you were never there. He drove to Columbus on Thursday, left Nadia with the neighbors down the street, a couple named the Garcias, who had a daughter Nadia's age, and a trampoline in the backyard that Nadia considered the greatest structure on earth. He told Nadia he had business to deal with and would be back the next day. She asked if it was the kind of business that was a big deal, or the little kind. He said medium. She squinted at him the way she did when she thought he was underplaying something. He kissed her forehead and left before she could ask a follow-up. Frank's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. They spread documents across the conference table and worked for 3 hours. By the end, Frank's expression had settled into something calm and hard, which in Evan's experience meant the situation was serious but manageable. The signature is a forgery, Frank said. I've got a forensic document examiner I use. She can have a report in 72 hours. The letter forms are off. The way you write your K is distinctive, and whoever did this didn't know that. Brett did this, Evan said. It wasn't a question. Or someone he hired. Either way, Frank closed the folder. We can stop this acquisition cold. Your original co-founder agreement gives you veto rights over any sale above $200 million. That language was never changed because the only way to change it was with your signature, which they don't have legitimately. The forged document doesn't hold up. How long does this take? If we file for an emergency injunction tomorrow, we can halt the closing pending review. Maybe 48 hours to get the order. After that, it's up to how fast we can build the case. Evan nodded. He thought about Nadia at the Garcia house, probably bouncing on the trampoline right now, not thinking about any of this. Do it, he said. He drove back to Delwood that night. He didn't sleep much. At 6 in the morning, Nadia climbed into his bed the way she had since she was 3, tucked herself against his side, and asked if everything was okay. He said yes. She said he looked like he was thinking about something hard. He said sometimes adults had problems that needed solving. She said she had a problem too. He asked what it was. She said she couldn't decide if she wanted to be an astronaut or a veterinarian. He said those weren't mutually exclusive. She thought about that for a while, and then she said maybe she'd be a space vet. He said that sounded about right. She fell back asleep. He lay there in the gray early light, staring at the ceiling, and thought about Claire and about the company they'd planned together on a legal pad at their kitchen table 12 years ago. and about the fact that someone had signed his name to a document to take it from him. He was in the shop by 8. Frank called at 9:30. Injunction filed, Frank said. Judge Yamamoto has it. She's known for moving fast on commercial matters. We might hear something today? And Vance and Alderton? They'll know by noon if they don't already. Their lawyers will push back immediately. Standard procedure. But the injunction freezes the closing until she rules. Evan was in the middle of diagnosing an electrical fault on a Subaru Outback when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Not Cincinnati this time. Columbus, he answered. Mr. Kowalski. The voice was different from Sylvie Hartman's, sharper, less coached. My name is Denton Ward. I'm outside counsel for Vance and Alderton. I understand you've filed for injunctive relief. That's right. I'd like to suggest that a phone call between you and our client might be more productive then. I don't do phone calls without my attorney. A pause. Of course. We'll contact Mr. Okafor's office directly. He hung up and called Frank. They'll want to meet, Frank said. Probably want to offer you something to drop the injunction and sign off on the closing. What do I do? You listen. You say nothing. You let me do the talking. And you do not, under any circumstances, tell them about the handwriting analysis until I say so. Right now, they don't know we have it. That's our leverage. The meeting was set for the following Monday. Vance and Alderton's offices in Cincinnati. Evan drove down Sunday night, got a room at a Marriott that smelled like industrial cleaner, an air freshener, slept badly, ate a continental breakfast that he couldn't taste, and arrived at the building at 8:55 with Frank and Frank's associate, a young woman named Kezia who'd been taking notes so fast during their prep session that her pen had run dry. The building was the kind of glass and steel structure that announced its own importance. Lobby art that looked expensive and meant nothing. Receptionist who smiled at them with the specific efficiency of someone doing a job she was good at, but didn't particularly love. They were taken to the 32nd floor. The conference room had a view of the Ohio River. The table could seat 20. There were 6 people on the Vance and Alderton side. Denton Ward, 2 associates, Sylvie Hartman, a man introduced as the CFO whose name Evan immediately forgot, and at the head of the table, Constance Vance. Evan had looked her up, 61 years old. Built the Vance and Alderton Group from a small private equity firm into one of the largest regional acquisition companies in the Midwest. 3 failed marriages, by various accounts. A reputation for identifying undervalued industrial assets and extracting value from them with what financial journalists described as precision, and what the people who'd worked at those acquired companies described as something less flattering. She was smaller in person than she'd seemed in photographs. Gray hair, short and unadorned, dark suit, eyes that moved across the room like she was continuously updating a calculation. Those eyes landed on Evan and stayed there. Mr. Kowalski, she said, thank you for coming. Thank you for the room, he said, because Frank had told him to stay neutral. She studied him for a moment. He'd worn his least bad shirt and a jacket that actually fit. Frank had suggested he wear something that signaled he'd made an effort without looking like he was trying to look like someone he wasn't. He was a mechanic who used to be an engineer. He looked like it. He didn't try to hide it. Denton Ward started talking about the acquisition timeline, the stakeholder process, the mutual interest in reaching a resolution. Frank listened without expression. Kezia took notes. Evan watched Constance Vance, who was watching him back. After about 8 minutes of preliminary positioning, Ward said, Our position is that the governance restructuring completed 18 months ago was executed properly, including with the consent of all relevant stakeholders. We'd like to discuss a path that allows the closing to proceed on schedule. Frank said, Which stakeholders? All parties with veto rights under the original co-founder agreement, including my client. A pause. The documentation reflects his consent. Frank said very calmly, Would you like to explain the documentation to us, or shall we explain it to you? Another pause, longer this time. Ward glanced at Constance Vance. She didn't look at him. She was still looking at Evan. What exactly are you alleging? Ward said. We're not alleging anything in this room, Frank said. We have a forensic document examination underway that will speak for itself in court. What we're doing in this room is giving your client an opportunity to understand the situation before it becomes a matter of public record. Ward's expression flickered. A forensic examination. of the signature attributed to Mr. Kowalski on the governance restructuring documents. My client did not sign those documents. He was not contacted, not consulted, and not present when they were executed. The signature is a forgery. The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like a change in pressure. Constance Vance spoke. She'd been silent for almost 10 minutes, which Evan suspected was unusual for her in any room. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, "did Brett Harmon tell you he was negotiating this sale?" Evan looked at her. "No." "Did he contact you at any point in the last 18 months regarding the company's direction?" "No." "You left the company 3 years ago, yes." "Why?" Frank started to speak. Evan held up a hand slightly. "My wife died," he said. "I needed to not be in Columbus anymore." Something shifted in Constance Vance's face. Not much, a small adjustment around the eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. It sounded like she meant it, which surprised him. "Thank you," he said. She turned to Ward. "Denton, give us the room." Ward blinked. "Constance, attorneys can stay. Everyone else, please." The CFO, the associates, Sylvie Hartman. They gathered their materials and left without argument, which told Evan something about how Constance Vance ran things. Kezia stayed, pen ready. Frank stayed, face neutral. Evan stayed. When the door closed, Constance Vance leaned back in her chair and said, "Mr. Harmon told us the co-founder agreement had been amended with all parties' consent. We conducted standard due diligence. The documentation appeared in order." She paused. "If what you're telling me is true, if the signature is forged, then Brett Harmon misrepresented material facts to us in the course of a billion-dollar transaction." Evan said nothing. Frank had told him not to in situations like this. "That exposes him to significant civil and criminal liability," she continued, "and it exposes us to a failed closing and considerable reputational damage." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not panicked. "Processing. How solid is the handwriting analysis?" Frank answered that one. "Solid enough that we wouldn't be here if it weren't." She nodded slowly, looked at Evan again. "What do you want?" Frank started to speak. Evan said, "I want to know why." Constance Vance raised an eyebrow. "I spent 11 years building that company," Evan said. "I left because my wife died and I couldn't function. I didn't sell my stake. I didn't dissolve my rights. I just stepped back." He kept his voice level. He'd been holding this in the car, at the hotel, in the elevator. "Brett knew my stake was still active. He had to have known. So why didn't he just call me? Why not include me in the process? We built that company together." "I don't know the answer to that," she said. "I think you might have a guess." She was quiet for a moment. "The terms of the acquisition were favorable to Brett's position specifically. There are performance bonuses, rolled equity, guarantees, none of which would have survived a negotiation with a second informed co-founder at the table." Her voice was dry. "He likely calculated that contacting you was a complication he preferred to avoid. So he forged my signature instead. That's what your attorney is telling me." She didn't deny it. "And if he did, then I bought a company with tainted paperwork, and everything that follows from that closing is legally compromised." "Yes," Frank said. "It is." Constance Vance stood up and walked to the window. The Ohio River was gray and wide below them, moving without urgency. She stood there for a moment with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at it. "What would make this right?" she said. "Not to the room. To the window, or maybe to herself." Evan had thought about this. He'd thought about it in the car and at the hotel, and in the 2 nights of bad sleep before this meeting. He'd talked to Frank about it. He'd also, in the quiet part of the night, when he was most honest with himself, thought about what Claire would have said. She would have said, "Don't make it about the money." But the money was real, and so was Nadia. And so was the garage with the rust on the door, and so was the fact that Evan had given 11 years to something and been cut out of it like a paragraph someone decided didn't fit. "Full recognition of my equity stake," he said. "My original 14%, valued at the agreed acquisition price. No reduction, no negotiation on the number." Frank added the legal specifics, compensation structure, timeline, escrow. "And Brett Harmon?" Constance Vance said. "That's between you and your lawyers," Evan said. "And between Brett and whatever comes next for him." He paused. "But I want the record corrected. I want it documented that I was a co-founder of that company and that I did not consent to the restructuring and that my rights were violated. Not in a press release. In the legal record." She turned from the window. "Why does that matter to you?" "The documentation." "Because my daughter's going to grow up knowing her parents built something together. Evan said. Her mother worked on the original design specifications for the first product line. She deserves to know that didn't get erased. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one, less pressurized. Constance Vance looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that's taking stock of something. All right, she said. Frank looked up from his notes. All right, she said again, more definitively. We'll restructure the payment to reflect your legitimate stake. The legal record will reflect the co-founder history accurately, and we'll be initiating our own investigation into how those governance documents were prepared and filed, which I suspect will not go well for Mr. Harmon. She extended her hand across the table. Evan shook it. Her grip was firm and dry. For what it's worth, she said, whoever built the precision standards at Harmon, the tolerance specs for the transmission components, that's exceptional work. I've been in industrial acquisition for 30 years, and I don't see engineering like that often. My wife designed the quality control protocol, Evan said. I built the system around it. Constance Vance nodded. Then she should be in the record too. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure he could, in that moment. Frank handled the rest. Kezia wrote everything down. They wrapped up in another 40 minutes, drove back to Columbus, sat in Frank's conference room until 6 in the evening going through next steps. By the time Evan got in his car to drive back to Delwood, it was dark, and he was so tired that the highway looked like something from the edge of a dream. He stopped at a diner outside of Lancaster, ate eggs and toast, drank 2 cups of coffee, and called the Garcias to check on Nadia. Mrs. Garcia said Nadia had eaten a good dinner, beaten their daughter at 3 consecutive rounds of Go Fish, and was currently asleep in the guest room with the cat, which she had apparently named Gerald, despite the cat already having a name. He thanked her and hung up and sat there for a few minutes in the diner booth, looking at the window that showed him his own reflection. He looked tired. He looked like someone who'd been carrying something for a long time and had just set part of it down. He drove home. The process that followed was not fast or clean. Nothing involving lawyers and corporations ever was. Brett Harmon's legal team contested, filed responses, cited procedural issues, and requested extensions. Vance and Alderton's internal investigation turned up what Frank described as a fairly comprehensive record of deception that Brett had apparently constructed over the course of 2 years. There were emails. There were altered board minutes. There was a conversation with a notary that the notary, once contacted by investigators, had very clear recollections about and was not happy with. Evan followed the developments and updates from Frank and tried not to let it consume his days. He fixed Beverly's F-150, and she brought him coffee and said he looked like he had a lot on his mind. He said he did. She said that in her experience, most things worked out eventually, and the ones that didn't taught you something worth knowing. He said that was a wise way to think about it. She said she'd had 72 years to practice. He told Nadia, in pieces over several weeks, what was happening. He didn't tell her the financial details. He told her that he and her mother had built a company together when Nadia was very small, and that some people had tried to say he wasn't part of it, and that he was working to correct that. Nadia said, "That's not fair." He said, "No, it's not," she said. "Did Mom help build it?" He said, "She designed the most important part of it." Nadia thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Good. She should get credit." He wasn't sure what to do with his face when she said that, so he looked at the road. The forensic handwriting report came back definitive. The signature on the governance restructuring document was not Evan's. The letter forms were inconsistent in 6 specific ways, the most significant being the K in Kowalski. The way Evan had always written it, with a particular separation between the diagonal strokes that a forger would have had to study carefully to replicate and hadn't. Brett Harmon's lawyers tried one more round of maneuvering before they quietly began settlement discussions. 3 months after the cream-colored envelope arrived on Evan's workbench, the acquisition of Harmon Automotive closed with the corrected documentation. Evan's 14% was recognized. The legal record reflected Claire's contribution to the original IP. Brett Harmon was removed from the deal's executive incentive structure and was, Frank told Evan in a brief and almost cheerful phone call, looking at significant exposure on the forgery charge. The wire transfer arrived on a Wednesday. Evan was in the middle of changing brake pads on a Honda Pilot when his phone buzzed with a notification from his bank. He looked at it, looked back at the brake caliper, tightened the last bolt, and set his tools down. He sat on the shop stool for a few minutes. Then he called Frank to confirm everything had cleared, and Frank said it had, and Evan said thank you. And Frank said, "You did the hard part. You showed up." He picked up Nadia from school that afternoon like any other afternoon. She climbed into the truck and immediately started telling him about a presentation she had to do on an animal of her choosing, and whether he thought axolotls counted as interesting enough, or if that was too predictable. He said axolotls were genuinely remarkable animals, and she should do it. She said she'd already started the poster. They drove through town, past the diner, past the library, past the park, where they'd watched the 4th of July fireworks last summer with Claire's mother, who'd cried the whole time and pretended not to. "Dad," Nadia said. "Yeah. Is the stuff with the company finished?" "Yeah, it's finished." She nodded, looking out the window. "Did you win?" He thought about that word. Win. What Brett Harmon had tried to do, quietly, carefully, over 2 years, was take something that wasn't his to take. What Evan had done by showing up, by not letting it disappear, was make sure the record said what actually happened. "Yeah," he said. "I think so. Good." She went back to looking out the window. "Then can we get tacos?" He laughed. It came out rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. "Yeah, we can get tacos." They went to the place on Miller Street that she liked, the one with the orange walls and the hot sauce collection along the back counter. They sat in a booth, and she ordered 3 tacos and ate 2.5 before declaring herself finished. He ate his and drank a horchata and watched her draw a rough sketch of an axolotl on a napkin to show him what her poster would look like. She showed it to him. It looked like a combination of a fish, a dog, and a hand. "That's really good," he said. "It's not done," she said. "The gills are harder than they look." She kept drawing. He sat there in the orange light of that small restaurant in that small town, watching his daughter draw a creature she'd decided was worth caring about, and thought about Claire, the way he always did, with that particular texture of missing that had stopped feeling like loss after a while and started feeling more like presence. Like she was still somehow in the room. She would have loved this, the small absurdity of it. The tacos after the billion-dollar phone call. Nadia naming a stranger's cat Gerald. The rust on the car door that had character. He paid the check. On the drive home, Nadia fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head against the window, the napkin axolotl still in her hand. He drove carefully, the way he always drove with her in the car, and thought about what came next. Frank had asked him, in their final call, whether he was going to do anything differently now, whether the money changed the plan. Evan had thought about it honestly, the way Claire had always asked him to think about things, without flinching from what was true. He said, "The garage stays." Frank had paused. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He'd been sure before he said it. "It's what I do. It's where I want to be." He turned into their street. Nadia stirred, looked around, murmured something that wasn't quite a word. "We're home," he said. She nodded, still mostly asleep, and unbuckled her belt and climbed out of the truck. He watched her walk to the front door and stand there waiting for him, with the patient exhaustion of a child who needed her bed. He locked the truck and followed her in. He thought about Claire, about the legal pad on the kitchen table where they'd written out the first business plan, 12 years ago, in the apartment on Mercer Street that smelled like old carpet and possibility. He thought about the way she'd held the pen and said, "Here's what we're going to build." He thought about how they had built it, piece by piece, and how it had survived her, and how the record now said what was true. He unlocked the door. Nadia went straight to her room. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet and looked at nothing in particular. Then he made himself a cup of tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed. In the morning, there would be a carburetor waiting. There would be Nadia's axolotl poster to help with before school. There would be the ordinary wait of a day that asked nothing dramatic from him, only that he show up. He was good at that. He'd been good at it all along.